let's talk about my go-to street photography camera settings for a simple and effective experience. I'll share with you optimum settings that I like to go for, focusing methods, metering modes, and a few other helpful ideas. I almost always shoot in aperture priority, of sorts. I set my shutter speed to 1,000th of a second, my f-stop anywhere between f5.6 and f8, and then auto ISO. That's it. Video over. Jokes aside, let's talk about why, and of course, those settings change depending on the circumstances. So let's talk about it. First of all, capturing a good moment, telling a cool story, capturing something one in a million is far more important than the photo being sharp and correctly exposed. Just keep in mind that with documentary and street photography style work, we're trying to capture real life, at least I am, and real life isn't perfect, so neither do my pictures have to be. And with this genre of work, we kind of have permission to experiment and play around, and as much as I'm gonna reel off some rules and guidelines that I like to work with, do what you want, have fun with it, and if you do have or do make some accidental mistakes, it doesn't matter, lean into it, see what happens, and yeah, have fun. Let's paint a picture for the ideal camera settings. The sun is beaming and the light is out. I would typically go for f8, 1,000th of a second, and auto ISO, and the ISO being as low as possible. Ideally. I am now briefly going to talk about shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And if you already know all of that lingo, then feel free to skip ahead a few moments. But I would typically go for 1,000th of a second with the shutter speed to freeze motion completely. And I think something helpful to know is cameras with a higher megapixel count might require a higher shutter speed to completely freeze motion. 1,000th of a second on my Leica M11 at 60 megapixels is not the same as 1,000th of a second on a Fujifilm X100V, which is 26 megapixels. Shooting on the Fujifilm at 500th of a second might freeze time enough compared to 1,000th of a second on the M11. So keep that in mind, because even with film, you know, film reacts different to digital sensors. 500th of a second on film is plenty fast enough to completely freeze motion. Whereas, yeah, 500th of a second on my M11, and even when I was shooting on a Leica Q2, there was still, in places, a little touch of motion. And none of that is a problem anyway. I just thought that was useful info. So depending on the camera, you might need to bump the numbers up in your shutter speed, which is unfortunate because we need the light. A lot of this is a balancing act. Very quickly, for those that might not know, your ISO is just your digital exposure, and the higher that goes, 1600 to 3200 to 6400, the more digital noise you get, and it starts to look a little bit gross. So ideally, the ISO wants to stay quite low. Just like if you're shooting film, a 400 speed film will have finer and nicer grain compared to a 1600 speed film that might be a little bit more textured and rough. People generally like to keep the ISO low, but if you're shooting in London, especially, I was going to say in winter, but most of the year, it is just a bit grey and gloomy and it can be dark. So I do find myself shooting at 1600, 3200, and on occasion 5000 to 6400 ISO. It is what it is. I would rather have a little bit of digital noise and not sacrifice my other camera settings like my f-stop and my shutter speed as much. So it is a balancing act, but higher ISO numbers, I just kind of accept and deal with it to a limit. Jumping onto my aperture, my f-stop of choice, ideally I'd like to go for f8, and with this you would get a nice depth of field and more of your frame would be in focus. Generally speaking, myself included, street photographers would like to capture multiple layers and multiple elements in the same frame. So shooting at f8 or even f11 means you just have a bigger zone of focus. Compare this directly to portrait photography, where you might shoot at f1.8 or f2, so you get that nice, blurry, shallow depth of field. In street photography, that would be much more difficult to nail focus each time, obviously because one thing's going to be in focus and then you might miss extra details and subjects somewhere else in the frame because you've got such a low f-stop. The exception to my rule of always shooting between f5.6, f8, or even sometimes f11 is when I want to capture a tiny little detail specifically, or my intention is to separate the subject from the background. Then of course I will shoot at f2, f2.8, or f1.8. I will do that on occasion. It's probably like 10% of the time. 90% of the time, I'm somewhere between f5.6 and f11. Another more obvious reason to open up the aperture would be just needing more light. Maybe night photography is your thing, then obviously you're going to be shooting more at f1.8 to f4, that kind of range. Personally, for me, shooting street now as we enter winter, my settings will probably look something like f4, 500th of a second, and 1600 ISO, as opposed to the ideal f8, 1000th of a second, and a low ISO. As we enter the winter, I will just have to compensate my settings. Even though I don't necessarily want to, I will just lean into it and hopefully I still get some stuff that I like. If I am shooting in full aperture priority and I set my shutter speed to auto and my ISO to auto, I will have some parameters to work with. So a maximum ISO of 6400 and a minimum shutter speed of maybe 1/250th or 1/500th of a second. Depending on the camera, I will change those settings a little bit. On the Fujifilm X100V, I'm happy to go down to 2/50th of a second shutter speed and up to 6400 ISO. On the Leica M11, I would probably still go to 6400 ISO, but I would probably set my minimum shutter speed to 500th of a second. Those are if the conditions are decent. If the conditions are not so decent and I'm working in a darker setting, then I might just go fully manual and figure it out, but that's only if I have to. Making video thumbnails is a staple for any YouTuber. Viewers who are familiar with my channel will recognize the camera in hand style of thumbnail that I like to go for. So today I thought it'd be fun to show you behind the scenes of how I would create this thumbnail, specifically the one you're watching for this video, using Adobe Photoshop, who have sponsored this video. The first thing I might do is press Command T and then scale the picture up so it fits the thumbnail. But I don't like that the shard is cut off from the composition. The first tool I'm going to use is AI Generative Fill and select our rectangle tool. And I'm going to highlight the area that isn't filled out. Go to Edit, Generative Fill. Now in here you could write down what you want Photoshop to generate, but in this case, we just want it to fill in the blank. So this one's pretty straightforward. Click generate, it'll take a few moments and it should fill in the space. Over on the right-hand side, we have variations of it. We're gonna do the exact same thing on the right-hand side, and then we have the right-hand side of our thumbnail complete as well. The second tool I want to show you is the spot healing brush. Now this is a really simple tool that can help you clean up your images. I don't know what this thing in the top left is here above the shard, but I'm simply going to select the spot healing brush and it will remove it for me. Also, for example, this buoy in the middle of our image right here that's in the Thames might be distracting. We can select that and boom, we have removed the distraction. The next thing I'm gonna do is add some text by pressing T on the keyboard, and I might go for something very simple like essential settings. Something that might be fun here is placing this settings text behind our main subject, as we don't want anything blocking the camera. We want that to be the thing that's most obvious. So I'm gonna go over to the Magic Wand tool over here. I'm gonna press this drop down and we can either choose device or cloud, depending on how detailed or intensive you want it to select the subject. Both of them work fine, but I like to go for cloud just to make sure it gets the job done as good as possible. Click select subject, give it a moment, and it has selected my camera and my hand. I'm gonna press Command C and Command V, and down here you will see we have two layers. I'm also going to select the generative fill layers and the original layer and merge them so we don't get confused with layers and they all behave as the same image. And bring my essential settings in between them both. That way you can see that the word essential settings, or the word settings specifically, is placed nicely behind my camera. I hope you found that useful, and if you are a photographer with a YouTube channel, maybe you can take some of these ideas to implement into your thumbnails. Thank you again to Photoshop for sponsoring this video. Now let's get back to those camera settings. If we're shooting in any auto setting of any kind, then we also need to select a metering mode. Now my go-to is typically highlight weighted metering, and this just ensures that nothing gets completely overexposed. but the photograph is probably slightly underexposed in the shadows. But with most modern cameras being so good nowadays, this isn't a big deal. You can just use the shadow slider or even the exposure slider in post and bring back some details if you so wish. Talking about metering modes generally, you can just play around with this yourself depending on a couple of variables. Each camera kind of behaves a little bit differently in its exposuring and its metering, just slightly. And each camera also produces different RAW files. So different RAW files act differently depending on the type of look that you want or the way you edit. So if you find that most of your photographs are coming out underexposed and you don't like that, then change the metering and see what you can come up with using other settings. So again, this isn't really a big deal, and I've probably said enough about metering modes. But for me personally, I know some people might ask, then I just use highlight weighted, and that works for me. Let's now talk about some different focusing methods. If I'm using the Leica M11, obviously this is manual focus, so let's discuss that first. I would like to be shooting anywhere between f5.6 and f11. On the 28mm, if I'm shooting at f8, if I set my distance to roughly 2 meters on the lens, I will have anywhere between 4 feet and 15 feet in focus. That will be my zone of focus. So 4 feet in front of me all the way to 15 feet in front of me. I don't want this to turn into a full-blown zone focusing explanation, but if I'm on the move and I'm walking to and from anywhere, I will probably just set my distance to 2 meters. And then if they're a little bit further than 15 feet, I might push the lens just a millimeter or two. And if they're closer than 4 feet, then I'll just pull this tab this way, and then that will kind of adjust the zone. But if you're shooting at f8 or even f11, most of your frame is going to be in focus. So that is the beauty of zone focusing on a rangefinder. If I'm not using my M11 and perhaps the Fujifilm X100V and I'm autofocusing, I just keep this super simple. I don't use face tracking or any complex AF methods. I just select single point and try and keep the process as direct as possible. I prefer not having to half press and then press again. Compared to this, you can literally, if I just turn it on, set my distances. If I see anything, it's just one single press, whereas sometimes with autofocus systems, you have to press, wait to get the focus, and then shoot. I realize I'm making it sound more complex than it is. Most modern cameras are so good that the tracking system or the autofocus system is excellent, but I just don't want to have to rely on an autofocus system. And maybe I'm just saying that because I have this camera and I'm so used to it, but turning to a manual focus system is so much more straightforward. And I know it doesn't sound like it if you're thinking, how does he manual focus every shot? You just get used to it, I think, and it's a much nicer experience. And every situation on the street is so different that if I am setting up a shot where I'm stood for a while waiting for something to happen, or if I see something a certain distance away and I go out my way to try and capture something, then of course I will critical focus and I won't rely on my zone. But the zone focusing method is just when I'm on the move and I want to keep it as simple as possible. It's hard to talk about camera settings without going into the nuances of each situation. I guess one of the biggest takeaways I can give you for this video is you have to just be adaptable, and if the light is not working in your favor, you have to change some settings quickly and adapt. If the focusing method you're using is not being effective or you need to change what you're looking at, then you just quickly look down at your camera, make the adjustment, and off you go. So I think camera settings is about being adaptive to your environment as well as just, set and forget. In an ideal world, like I said at the beginning, f8, thousandths of a second, auto ISO, I'm good to go the whole day. But that's probably just in summer in reality. And in winter, I have to be more reactive and analyze the situation as I go. So that was just some of my ideas with camera settings and street photography, and I hope that wasn't too complex and that did make sense of sorts. So thank you for watching this video, I appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next week. Peace.